Howdy there, and God bless everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sermon Time. We're just going to jump right into this one. I'm trying to beat the severe weather. See if I can get this one recorded right under the wire. So, without further ado, why did God change? It's a question that many believers have wondered, though some of you, or some of them may scoff and say they've never thought that, because God never changes. God is the same today, yesterday, and tomorrow. And you know what? I actually agree with that. I do believe that the God that I worship is the same and has always been. However, that's not how he's been described in the Bible. The God of the Bible goes through distinct changes from book to book and sometimes even verse to verse. Sometimes he's incredibly patient, while other times his temper has a hair trigger and he angers very quickly, lashing out with deadly wrath and fire. Sometimes he's loving, compassionate, and understanding, while others he's cold and uncaring. He's shown as logical and calm, slow to anger, then shown to be overly emotional, overreacting to the slightest offense, oftentimes resulting in the deaths of those around him. I could go on and on. There's so many different examples of this. And then we get the biggest change when the New Testament shows up and the Lord gives up his son Jesus to die on the cross for us. Because they both love us so much that they were willing to sacrifice it all just so we, humanity, had a chance at a new life. That through their sacrifice and example, we could learn to better ourselves and live and love. Commanded us all to love and spread that love throughout the world. It was a pretty big change from the warlike God who endorsed, both genocide and slavery in the Old Testament. So what happened? Why is he written like that, and why does he change so much? Well, there's many reasons why God tends to bounce around a lot depending on who's writing him, but it all comes down to one thing. These stories were told, written down, and then edited by people. All different kinds of people who had their own agendas and beliefs. And people, as we all know, are imperfect. Now, we're going to briefly touch on a few different reasons for God changing throughout the Bible and why the writings are so different before we move on to our main focus later. So we're just going to skim over a bunch of things that, each one of these things could deserve their own individual study and could be or contain hours upon hours of discussion just by themselves. But we're just going to try to skim over them real quick to give you a background. So first up, the religion is really old. Like really, really old. And it used to be oral only. Things change a lot when passed from person to person by just word of mouth. Think of a game of telephone being played over thousands of years. A lot would change, wouldn't it? And next we have to understand that Judaism came out of much older Canaanite religions that had their own gods and pantheon. This is why originally God was referred to as El, since he was the high god over the Canaanite pantheon of gods. He was the one above all, and for the most part is the same God that is worshipped by later Judaism, and then now today by both Judaism, or not by both, by all Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But because there were a lot of other gods and stories both in the Canaanite religions and in the religions from the surrounding areas, some of their attributes got borrowed when they told stories about their god. Some stories and poems are straight up plagiarized, just swapping out one god for another. In fact, a lot of the warlike elements were borrowed from the god Baal, who originally was a child of El, and then became a lesser god that was to be shunned and his idols burned as the Israelites came more into power. Baal was the warlike storm god, wrathful and vengeful, and this is who many of the attributes got taken from and given to Yahweh or Adonai, the God of the Israelites. We also need to understand that there used to be two Jewish kingdoms as well, the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel, and that after they had both similar and different beliefs, but worshiped the same God. And it wasn't until the kingdoms fell and a lot of other bad things happen, that they kind of regrouped later as one, defining themselves under the more or less under the Judaism that we have today. But why make your God into a more warlike one when telling stories about them? Well, if you're trying to garner support from the people for a war, especially people who believe in that God, you would need that. You would also want to have that in the use of, when you tell stories that support the war effort, support the warriors and the soldiers, giving them hope. Go at this battle because God supports you, and here's a story of God supporting you, and so on and so forth. If you're in a battle or a war against someone and you want the people to know, you want the people, especially those fighting, that God, their God, is on their side. And you need stories showing that. But you might not always have the stories, or they may not relate directly to what's going on. So if you don't have any on hand, then you either need to make them up or borrow them from other sources. Tweak them a little bit. And that's more or less what they did, and that kind of brings me to our main focus here of why God changes so much. God changes so much in the Bible because of the Babylonian exile. During this period, the Jewish people were under mass oppression. They were experiencing mass relocation, exile, and a genocide, one of the many that they have experienced. They feared that their way of life was going to be forgotten. This was their main driving force for writing the Torah on paper once they developed a written language. And this, by the way, was kind of controversial, and even was sort of controversial even Jesus' day, as there were still sects of Jewish people, well, not scribes, I forgot what they'd be called, still sects within the temple that believed that writing things down wasn't holy or right. Kind of how you have people in Christianity who believe, the only translation that's good is the King James, despite it being an awful translation. And even in Islam, you have people that believe, the final revelation, that is the Quran, shouldn't be in any other language than its original language, which doesn't really make any sense, but there are these beliefs, this originalism. The problem with oral traditions, though, if you just stayed that way, is they change quite a lot. But the Jewish people didn't want their religion to be forgotten. Their people were scattered, things were dire, so they needed a record, especially for those who survived, so they could keep up their traditions and their way of life could continue. So scribes began writing, and in these writings they included new narratives that fit with the times that they were living in. This is more or less where we get the story of Exodus as we know it today. A story that has almost no historical backing or proof whatsoever, but would serve as inspiration for the Jewish people to keep them fighting. It would give them the hope and the will to survive during the exile. And it did. A story of their God coming down and saving them from their oppressors, freeing them from their slavery, sending plagues out against the horrible Pharaoh that wronged them. It was a rallying cry. But why make up that story? Well, it's likely that Exodus was based off of some form of exodus of Jewish people from Egypt, as there were long ties between the Jewish people and Egypt, but nothing like what is described in the book. There are some smaller exoduses that may have happened. There's one that's referenced in a tablet, but the one that even Josephus pointed out, which was an old Jewish historian way back in the day, one of our only sources, non-Christian sources to mention Jesus, believes that it's about the Hyksos. That's where it comes from, who were run out of Egypt. However, that's not a story you would kind of want to use right now, as it's not one where the Jewish people were freed from an oppressor. Rather, it was one where the Hyksos, who by the way were Jewish, they were a Jewish sect, and the Hyksos were the oppressors that were finally being run off by the Egyptians who rose up against them. That's not a great story to use right now when you're being in exile. It's not a story you would use to spur your own revolution. If anything, that story could be used to further the harm being done to your people, even though it has nothing to do, with you at modern time, or at the current time. Not modern. But people would use and manipulate that story to say, oh, well, these people have always been evil. They've always done this. They've always done that. So we should use whatever we can to oppress them, and so on and so forth. The Nazis did a very similar thing. So you had to come up with something else. And that's where we get Exodus. A combination of a bunch of different stories creating Moses, who doesn't seem to have a historical basis. Though we think there was some guy like Moses, but scholars aren't sure who he actually was, as there's no mention of him until after the Babylonian exile. But there are mentions of Yahweh, there's mentions of the Israelites, and there's mentions of the house of David and the other kings of Israel. It seems like they came first before the Moses story. But another question you may have is, why make up a story instead of just talking about what was happening at the time and how God would save you from it? Well, if you're currently being oppressed by a people, and it's a violent oppression, speaking openly against them could be dangerous. These stories would be circulated amongst people, and it would make sense to not have them speak directly against the oppressors in order to keep themselves safe and to ensure the story stayed in circulation. This was something similar that happened in the New Testament, where they wouldn't outright speak against the Roman government. In fact, wanted to make sure that the Romans saw Christians in a good light, had favor with them. Because if you just, even though they were being oppressed by the Romans, they didn't want to directly speak out against them, hoping that this would lead to them not being oppressed. Though they would put in hints and secrets, and they would say things off to the side, but their official writings and sermons that would be preached to everyone who could listen, they wouldn't have specifically anti-Roman language, just like you wouldn't have anti-Neo-Babylonian language here in these sermons. And it allows you and your people to be able to keep going to church, keep going to temple, being able to worship as they were still allowed to worship. So you have to come up with a placeholder story. And Exodus is a powerful story of freedom, but it doesn't directly go against the Neo-Babylonian Empire. It wouldn't perk the ears of any officials listening in for talks of uprising. And the Exodus story is powerful even to this day, and other governments have realized its potential to stoke anti-government uprising. Slave Bibles were made in America that had omitted much of Exodus and any pro-freedom, anti-slavery scriptures while highlighting the pro-slavery scriptures. They wanted to make sure that the slave population didn't feel inspired to rise up against them, or view God as being against the slave owner. Despite this, though, Christianity, as well as other spiritual beliefs, played an important role in ending slavery and giving the enslaved people hope to endure. Many abolitionists were Christians, and not just Christians. When you look at the Abrahamic religions as a whole, many of them, though being in the minority, sadly, many Jewish people being anti-slavery in general, not even getting to the African chattel slavery, but being anti-slavery in general. But they were a minority voice. Many Christians, but still a minority voice. And then we get into the American slavery. You have John Brown. Then you have anti-racism preaching of the Pentecostals, which is crazy because they are not the same as they used to be. But they were the anti-segregation, anti-racism church for a while. And you have Martin Luther King, who everyone forgets is a reverend. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a reverend. And so many Christians that were trying to lead this fight against white supremacy over history. Despite the Bible, more or less, well, not more or less, actually endorsing slavery in parts, though kind of talking out the side of its mouth and being against it in others. And that has to do with the time it was written and slavery being viewed very differently. So they just made laws and rules thinking it was just a part of everyday life. Though this wasn't the only belief, but it was the belief of the writers. Just like it was the belief of the writers of the other things we're about to talk about. The beliefs and the influences that would influence Exodus, but it doesn't stop at Exodus. Much of the Old Testament was written during the exile, and this is why God is so warlike. There are many stories of war and outright genocide commanded by God in the Old Testament against any nation that stood against him and his people. But despite appearing to be historical accounts, ones that don't paint the Jewish people or the Israelites in a very good light, there's no evidence for these mass genocides. None. And this is a good thing. The Old Testament describes these accounts of land being taken by force, commanding the Israelites to kill every man, woman, and child, a complete cleansing of the area. But the evidence that we have suggests that not only did this not happen, but the Israelites in these lands were rather peaceful, and they assimilated over time, or just arrived to lands that were already emptied. But why have these stories then if they didn't happen? Especially ones that don't paint your people in the best light. Well, there is a reason. Though these stories could be used to justify other genocides, including ones against Jewish people, they wrote them because it was a fantasy. It was a revenge fantasy. Under the guise of being a historical retelling, the authors are telling a story where their God utterly and completely destroyed any people or kingdom who threatened his people. That is, anyone who threatened them. Anyone that hurt them would suffer dearly. They would get the literal wrath of God. It's a revenge fantasy from people who are going through horrible oppression and a genocide themselves. A fantasy of hope, well, kind of fueled by hope and hatred that kept them going, but one that was ultimately wrong. We all have fantasies, many of which we're not proud to admit. Many of us daydream in order to just make it through the day, but many of these should just stay what they are, fantasies and dreams. They have no place in the real world, and they shouldn't be acted out. Now, of course, this isn't all fantasies, but you know the ones I'm talking about. The ones where you think about, I would just want to kill my boss or my coworker. But we all know should never act that out, and that would be crazy, and that's wrong, and that's evil, but we've all had that. Someone's just pushed just a little bit too far, and we have that thought, that fantasy. That's what these are. Many of us understand this and would never act on such fantasies, just like many of us would never repeat the actions we see in some video games like Grand Theft Auto. Fantasy is fun, even healthy, but it should stay fantasy. It's when these fantasies become beliefs and actions that there's a problem. It should be understood in no uncertain terms that genocide and ethnic cleansings are evil and have no place in our world or our religion, or any religion. There is no and never will be justification for such heinous acts. However, it makes sense that someone enduring such hardships would daydream about doing the same things to their oppressors that they were enduring. But that should stay a daydream. If the oppressed only rise up to become oppressors, then we are just repeating the same cycle of violence, hate, and abuse that they sought to free themselves from. And technically, they're doing the very thing that their oppressors were afraid they would do. The oppressed should rise up to end their oppression, but not just so they can cause it on others. Injustice and oppression are vile, not because they were done to you, but because they were done at all. A bad thing is a bad thing because it is bad, not just because it happened to you. Violence is an effective tool and should be used in defense when it is absolutely necessary. But never should it be used just to cause harm just because you can. You shouldn't hurt someone just because you want to, nor should you because it might make you feel better. Because at that point, you don't want to make things better. You don't want to end oppression. You just want to hurt people because you like it. You just want to become the oppressor. You just want to become the abuser. That may not be all your fault. It may not be all their fault. It may be because of all this trauma and horrible things they've gone through. They think that there's only two states of being, the victim and the victimizer, and they might as well be the victimizer. They might as well be the abuser, because at least then they won't have to be the abused. But that's not how this works. And we all know that. And again, this isn't to say if you've had fantasies like this that you're a bad person. You're not, and neither are the countless people who have been oppressed over the eons who've dreamed in the same way. In a way, neither are the writers here, as many probably didn't intend for these scriptures to be taken as an endorsement of genocide to be used by further generations. They were hurting, and they just wanted it to stop. They wanted God to be on their side, and they wanted him to put an end to their pain and to their enemies. The thought in of itself isn't the problem, but they wrote it down as scripture. And that scripture was taken and then used to justify atrocities in the name of God. These people were suffering. They wanted justice, and they deserved justice. But that's long been forgotten. These scriptures, along with all of the Bible, should be read understanding the context in which they were written. The book of Deuteronomy itself was written with the intent to challenge the reader, saying that one cannot passively read it, but must be an interpreter. You have to actually study and care about what you're reading so that you can get the full meaning of it. Otherwise, you will be lost, and its meaning lost on you. So, God didn't change, but the people writing about him did. Their world was crumbling around them, and they needed vengeance. In my view, it wasn't particularly right of them to use the Lord or his name in an attempt to get that vengeance, especially with how the scriptures can be used and misinterpreted, but I also don't think that their intent was completely wrong. They wanted justice and freedom. They needed a way to get it. And those are things that God wants as well, and the writers did their best to convey that. But this type of narrative, especially in written form, was new. They made mistakes, probably expecting things to be fixed later by other people, or expecting the reader to know all of the context and all the ins and outs, the secrets, the inside jokes, and so on and so forth, or just have the ability to go and talk to the person who wrote it. They likely weren't thinking about how this would be read thousands of years later, especially by people who didn't speak anything close to the language that they did. They wrote what was needed at the time, or what they believed was needed at the time. And this is why God changes in the late Old Testament books and becomes more compassionate, loving, and patient. And then especially why he changes in the New Testament. The mood changed, so did the times. It's why he's viewed very differently today in Judaism and in Islam and Christianity. He is loving, he is compassionate, he is kind, he is all-knowing, he is beautiful. He is our God. That's why almost immediately after these terrible stories that are in these scriptures are written, there are scriptures right next to them that contradict them, saying we aren't supposed to seek vengeance, that vengeance is the Lord's, and that we are supposed to be kind, we're supposed to be loving. We're not supposed to be violent, we're not supposed to act out. And that's in the Old Testament, long before we get to Jesus. It's why the modern mission of Christianity is to spread love and to love all. So with that, go with love. Go with Christ, and may God bless you. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.